I've been looking forward to this one especially. For those of you who weren't here last week, this series is inspired by the spirit of rolled tweet. Augustana's Conrad Bergendorf Professor Emeritus in the Humanities. Tweet loved to spark conversations, competitive conversations around the best book ever among his faculty colleagues, so we thought we'd try to keep that spirit here. And also to honor the spirit of tweet, I made a promise to myself during each of the 4 introductions, I'll give you one tweetism or tweet story. My family called it actually getting tweeted. Before there was a Twitter, that if you got tweeted, that means you got pranked or something like that. But I also had the gift of having him as a student. And those who had him for what we used to call freshman rhetoric, it's now, I think, college writing, something similar along those lines, a much more humane title. But the exercises he came up with were bedeviling and brilliant. And a couple that I wanted to share with you is one, we had to give an entire 10-page essay in which we were only allowed to use 3 multisyllabic words. And if you went with 4, you lost a letter grade. I don't think anyone really did. He just did that as a threat. Then another one in which we were only allowed to use a very common letter, and I think it was N, only about 10 times in a 15-page paper. And the genius, though, is it really made you think about writing. And even then we were using manual typewriters, right? But it harkened back to the amount of thought you had to use with a quill and an inkwell. You really had to think before you committed that word to paper. And so those were among his more genius, I think, inspired assignments. Plus, he always had a great sense of fun. When we had to write a persuasive paper, mine was all about how Illinois should become an independent republic and secede. And the first thing we would do is take down that which separates Chicago from downstate, namely the suburbs, and relocate them to North Dakota. And he was a good sport about the whole thing, and I think I even got a passing grade, maybe. But today, with that little context setting of tweet, we get a chance to hear from really one of my favorite professors, someone that I really wish I had had a chance to take a class from. I took a little bit of Latin at Augustana, but I never had a professor like Kirsten Day. After completing her bachelor's degree in ancient Mediterranean civilizations, art and art history, slacker, at Rice University, she would go on to receive her master's and doctorate at the University of Arkansas, woo pig sooie, but I'm not going to try to do it the right way. And since 2007, she's been on the faculty at Augustana College in teaching both classics and women's and gender studies, and we're very grateful for that. During her time at Augustana, she's taken students to Greece to study antiquity at close proximity, which I think is a wonderful thing for our students. Her research focus has been on classical representations in contemporary culture, including representations of women, but also self-perceptions of women. And if you get a chance, she's got some very interesting writings. You can see her curriculum vitae on the college's website. Today she is chair of classics, and as I mentioned, also teaches in women's and gender studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kirsten Day.
Thank you for that nice introduction and for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. I only knew Roll Tweet a little bit. He worked, his wife, Margaret, was on the Keystone Neighborhood Association board with me for a while, and we worked together on some of those initiatives. But I didn't know him very well, but I think I would have liked to have him as a teacher. And I kind of like his spirit of competitive argumentation and things like that. So I'm here to tell you why Dr. McDowell was wrong last week, and I'm right. And don't listen to those people that come after either, because this is the best book ever. Oops, we lost our thing. Walla?
Oh, there you go.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to jump in real quickly. But first I want to ask, who was here last week? A few of you? Okay, and who has read the Odyssey before? Okay, so a few more than had read Ulysses, and indeed it is a little bit more accessible. I think only 2 people last week had read Ulysses, and we have like 5 or something like that here. But you should all read it. Everyone should read the Odyssey at some point in their life. But everyone's heard of it, I assume. I'll just make that assumption. It is the second oldest. Let's see if I can remember how to advance.
I think just spacebar.
There we go. It's the second oldest literary work in the Western tradition, and I'm putting that in quotation marks because if you've been following recent scholarship, that term is fairly problematized. And I don't want to get too far into that right now, but so the Western tradition is sort of influenced by European culture, and there's some problems with how it's contextualized and things like that, but we still kind of understand those divisions, and so I'm going to use it for the quotation marks. So it's the second oldest, the oldest being the Iliad, also by Homer, who wrote the Odyssey, or who wrote it. The question about who wrote it actually is a very sticky wicket, which is not the main part of what we're looking at today. But I would mention that there are older things in the Eastern tradition, and we'll talk a little bit perhaps about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is far older, about 1,000 years older than the events of the Odyssey, which are about 500, 600 years before it was written down. So it is quite a bit older, and it has a lot of the same elements, so just give a little nod to the Epic of Gilgamesh there. So it dates to the 8th century BC. It's a Greek epic poem. So if you see a translation that's done in prose, I always kind of react against that, because a poem should be a poem, and it should be translated by someone who can handle the poetry. So before we get into what it's about, I just want to kind of acknowledge the poetic meter here. The poetic meter for epic is hexameters, which means it has 6 feet. I don't know if we have any poets in here, but 6 feet of poet experts. So either spondies, which is 2 longs, boom, boom, or spondie, or sorry, why am I losing my brain here? And I am the long, short, short. So you can have any of those in any of the feet except for the last one, which consists of just 2 beats, and the last one could be long or short. So anyway, all that is to say, it has a beat, something like da 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 da. So it's kind of like rapping, right? Early rapping? Yeah? No? But we'll take a look at how that works out into Greek in just a minute, so you can kind of feel the beat of it. The most natural meter, I'm not a poet per se, my understanding is the most natural meter for English is the iambic pentameter, which more clearly approximates English. This works better in Greek than it does in English, but some people have written poems and things in hexameters in English, and it's harder. So what is it about? This is the story of Odysseus, the Greek hero Odysseus' journey back from the Trojan War, trying to get home. And of course, we don't have planes back then, and things aren't as easy. So it takes him 10 years to get home after a 10-year war. This war, of course, is the Trojan War. You've probably all heard of the base that launched 1,000 ships, Helen of Troy, who was only of Troy because she was stolen? That's another controversy. From her husband Menelaus, who was a Spartan Greek king. So after 10 years of fighting, striving to get home, persecuted by Poseidon, who's angry at him for various reasons. And so we have a large geographical swath that we're going to get to cover in this epic, which is very, very exciting. But as the Iliad does before it, starts kind of in the middle of things. It starts in the middle of this journey on the island of Calypso, which you can see on the bottom left. But I should say that this is only one map that has been kind of conjectured for where these events would take place. It's not entirely clear always. So we start there, and we get some of the backstory a little bit later. So he needs to get home to his wife Penelope, who's waiting for him, but he's going to find some trouble in his house. So he has to sort out those problems when he gets home. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it's about. We'll see a little bit more of things as we go along. So let's look real quickly at the proem. This is what Greek looks like if you aren't aware. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read the first few lines just so you can get a sense of what it sounded like, sort of in the original, although this is ancient Greek, and so some of it is, I'm not going to be perfect at it. There's some controversies over exactly how it might have been pronounced, right? But you can kind of hear the beat when I do it. So, Andreboy Anape, Musa, Polutropon, Hosmalatola, Plumfe, a Patroie, Sierron, Toliefra, the Perse, Polon, Dantropon, Ere, Astia, Klein on Egno, Pola de Bain Pantoi, Papa Aldia, Home Catatumo, Arnimanos Ente, Supain, Noston Hetairo. Doesn't it sound grand? Best. So this is called a proem, and most epics have a proem, which is kind of like the first few lines, which give you kind of in a nutshell what this epic is about. So let's see what it says in English. So I'm going to use Stanley Lombardo's translation here, and I often use Stanley Lombardo for my introductory classes because he's really accessible and easy translation to read while still being responsible. Generally speaking, I mean, people will argue with me, but I think it's very good for kind of entry-level students. But I don't really like his first two words here, speak memory. What really it should say is sing in me muse, because he's accessing the muses to help him sing this great, great song. So he's avoiding being too cocky, which will get you smited by the gods. But at the same time, he's also saying this is so great that it's really coming from muses. So it's a kind of a humble brag there. In any case, so these are the lines. Speak memory of the cunning hero, the wanderer blown off course time and again, after he plundered Troy's sacred heights. Speak of all the cities he saw, the mines he grasped, the suffering deep in his heart at sea, as he struggled to survive and bring his men home. But he could not save them, hard as he tried. The fools destroyed by their own recklessness when they ate the oxen of Hyperion the sun, and that god snuffed out the day of his return. So it gives us a little bit of what we're going to see. And it's a spoiler, right? I mean, and most of the time in our narratives today, we don't like spoilers. So they tell us right up front, they're going to die, right? So we know that's going to happen. And they do. They're destroyed by their own recklessness, and that's important. It's one of the lessons of the Odyssey, that you have to use restraint. It's often called heroic restraint in this sort of context. You have to be able to restrain yourself from food, drink, alcohol, sex, whatever kind of enjoyment there is when there's a duty to be done, right? You have to know when is the time you can do that and when you need to stay the course, right? So Odysseus has some failings in this area himself, but he's able to use heroic restraint enough that he survives, right? But not his men. They get stronger. Sorry. All right, so that's kind of where we start. So I'm just going to dive right into why we're not going to. I don't have a year to talk about everything here, but I'll tell you a little bit about why I think it's so fantastic. First of all, it has everything that you could possibly want, right? You want action and adventure? You got it. Things to see? Yes. Sex, violence, intrigue, suspense, comedy, tragedy? Yes. Heroes and villains? Yes. Vengeance, battles, the final showdown, gods, mortals, monsters, witches, giants, a love story. That's also in quotation marks because it was a little different back then. Coming of age story, family drama, and more. There's a lot more. But there's a lot of things in here. Something that everybody likes, I would think. Unless you're a terrible person. I don't know. I don't know why you wouldn't like it. It's awesome. Okay, so just real quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about comedy because I don't want to be just all general. So what's comic in this story where all his companions die? Well, probably most of you have heard of the episode of the Cyclops, right? The Cyclops is the big one-eyed giant that he encounters. And this is a closed room story. This is just one of his adventures on his way home. He gets trapped with his men, some of his men, in the Cyclops cave. And he's unable to get out. The Cyclops is a man-eating, monster in some ways. And so he has to figure out a way out of this closed room, just using his brains and the things at hand, right? So, probably many of you know this story, but I'm going to retell it in general real quickly. So, they get the Cyclops drunk. They happen to have some super strong wine, and the Cyclops doesn't use heroic restraint. So he drinks too much, gets drunk, passes out, and gives Odysseus and his men the opportunity to poke his eye out with a big stick. So blinded, he can't find them to eat them. Eventually, he has to take the stone away from the opening and let his sheep out, and they're able to escape under their bellies, the sheep's bellies, because he's feeling them on the top and trying to escort them out. So that's how he gets out. Very clever, right? But in the course of this, the Cyclops, when he's getting drunk, he says, "What's your name?" And Odysseus says, "My name is Utis." So this is a joke that works in Greek much better than it works in English. So most people translate Utis as no man or nobody. And it just feels a little obvious and awkward to me in English. But it works a little bit better in Greek because it's 2 words versus 1 word for one thing. Just a little bit more elegant. So he says, "My name is Utis." And so the Cyclops says, "Well, Utis, my gift to you is I'll eat you last." So then after he gets his eye poked out, he starts screaming for help. And then the other Cyclops come up and say, "What's wrong?" They're at the door. They're like, "What's wrong in there? What's going on? Who's hurting you? Who's troubling you?" And the Cyclops says, "No one. No one's hurting me." But of course, in Greek, it's saying Utis, right? So then the other Cyclops say, "Well, if nobody's hurting you, then it must be something by the gods, and we can't help you. See you, bye." And they leave, right? But in Greek, what they're saying is not Utis. When they respond, they're saying Metis, because it's a different mood in the Greek language. So instead of U, it's a me. So instead of Utis, which means nobody, it's Metis. And if you put those 2 words together, it sounds like cleverness. So cleverness is killing. And it just is like, that's right, cleverness, that's me, I'm killing it, right? So it's a really nice little verbal play on words that you can't really replicate in English or in most translations, but it works really well in Greek. That's why you all need to say Greek in order to enjoy this even more. So a little bit of comedy. And so Odysseus laughs to see how well this little trick had worked, ha ha ha, and we all kind of laugh along with him. But at the same time, it's really kind of uncomfortable because the Cyclops is over there writhing in pain because he's just had his eye put out. So it's almost uncomfortable that this is a joke. Even though the Cyclops is kind of monstrous, it still feels a little bit uncomfortable to be laughing at this point, right? So there's actually quite a lot going on there. So anyway, a lot of things. Something for everyone. All right, why else is it so fantastic? It's groundbreaking. Well, it's hard not to be when it's the second literary work that's preserved. But a few things that are interesting that we still utilize in many of our narratives today are the hero's journey. Like, we see that a lot, right? It's in a lot of Western films, which I'm particularly interested in, but also things like Star Wars, Percy Jackson, many of our modern narratives utilize the hero's journey. The flashback or the tale within a tale. This is the first, really. There's some tales within a tale in the Iliad as well, but not an extended flashback like this. So it's a 24-book epic, and 4 of those books are Odysseus telling the story of how he got to Calypso's island from the Trojan War. So it's an extended narrative flashback that he's telling. Catabasis. You might not know this word. It means descent into the underworld. And Odysseus has a literal descent into the underworld in his narrative story. He tells that he actually went down into the underworld physically. But we often have this appear in many of our narratives today in other forms. Sometimes it's actually a real descent to the underworld, like in Percy Jackson and some other narratives. But sometimes it's more kind of like a psychological journey to the underworld. Sometimes it's a dream sequence or some drug trip, or it could also be like some experience in water. Sometimes it symbolizes this, by kind of accessing your subconscious and things like that. Those things come up in the catabasis that we have in the Odyssey. Also the first feminist speech. So I like to highlight this because feminism, what, in the 8th century BC? So I don't know if I can say the B word in here, but so Calypso is holding Odysseus against his will on her island and using him for her boy toy. He wants to leave and go home to his wife and family and things like that, but she's enjoying it. Eventually the gods send Hermes down and say, Zeus says you gotta let him go. And she's like, angry. You gods are the most jealous bastards in the universe. You persecute any goddess who ever openly takes a mortal lover to her bed and sleeps with him. And she lists off some goddesses who've had mortal lovers and they've been killed or otherwise eliminated. She's like, and now you're after me for having a man. But you said Hermes, Zeus has Aegis, and none of us gods can oppose his will. So she's doing two things here. She's saying there is a double standard between gods and goddesses, and that is not fair. And she's also saying that this is a patriarchy, and there's nothing I can do about it, and that sucks, right? And so this is really a feminist speech, but it's also problematic because, as I just told you, she's holding Odysseus against his will. So that's a matter of consent that makes us a little bit uncomfortable, especially in our modern Me Too era, and things like that. So there's a lot to delve into there. But anyway, groundbreaking. What else is multi-layered? Oh my gosh. So Ulysses is complicated. This is also complicated. But the nice thing about the Odyssey is that you can read it without delving into those deeper layers if you want to, and still get a lot out of it, still entertaining, and a good story. But if you want to dive in a little deeper, you might look a little closer at Odysseus. He's a complicated man, right? So he's kind of known for having a slick tongue. He's a very good talker. And in the course of the epic, he tells at least 3 very extended lies. Like that, he's pretending to be a beggar when he gets home and comes home in disguise. And he tells these very, very long lies about his whole backstory and how he got there. So he's a good liar, right? And we know those are lies. But that kind of begs the question, like, where else is he lying where it's not as obvious? Remember those 4 books of flashback? And we're talking about things like a Cyclops and other fantastic monsters and witches and things like that. He went to the underworld. You saw Heracles down there, Hercules. How much of that is kind of an agenda-driven embellishments? How much of it is outright lies? And how much of it actually happened to him? We don't really ever find out. I think that's kind of interesting to kind of look for those points where like, looks like maybe he said they did. So you can really dig deeper there. His wife Penelope, when he comes home, he's in disguise. And he's like, don't tell her, I'm not telling her, because he wants to see if she's been faithful to him, right? Because he can go sleep with all the goddesses he wants, but she needs to be faithful to him. It's a big double standard. So if you're reading this in one way, she doesn't know anything, and she's just crying, and I'm waiting for my husband to come home. She talks to the beggar. She doesn't know anything until Odysseus reveals himself to her. But there's a lot of scholars in recent decades who said, hold on, she knows a lot more than she's letting on, and here's why. And here's how she's talking to him in code, and here's why she's talking to him in code. And they're doing this real dance of communication in order to maximize their chances of both surviving this ordeal well. So there's a lot to look at right there. But at the same time, there's still arguments about this, and that's the beauty of it, to me, is that there's some ambiguity, right? I can argue this, you can argue that, and we can argue forever, and not change each other's minds, but it's not entirely clear. And to me, that's kind of the beauty of it. It leaves you to make your own decisions. It leaves you to question and wonder. And I really like that. All right, what else? It tackles big issues. So things like the justice of revenge, right? Odysseus slaughters numerous suitors in his household. They've assumed that he's dead because he's been gone for 20 years. And they want to woo his wife because she's the queen. And he comes home, he hatches this plan, gets a few allies, and slaughters them all to a man. The good ones, the bad ones. There are some that have been less bad than they're dead, right? So is this just? But that's something to kind of think about. There's two arguments to be made there, at least. But at the same time, it does not shy away from the fact that this is going to kind of birth a cycle of revenge. We've seen that in, Hatfields and McCoys, didn't they do that? But like, oh, well, you killed my son, now I'm going to kill you. Oh, now you killed my dad, I'm going to kill you. So it goes back and forth, and where does it end? Well, here, it ends with a Dea ex machina. Athena coming down and saying, stop. The only way to stop that kind of cycle of violence is through kind of almost a supernatural, event. So it's really interesting and something to think about. So the nature of marriage, what makes a good marriage is another thing. Multiple perspectives. Just real quickly, I'll give you an example of that. So Penelope, one of her famous tricks is that she's weaving a shroud, and she tells the suitors, in order to kind of delay them, she said, in the hopes that her husband will come home, she says, I will choose one of you to marry when I finish the shroud. So she weaves it by day and unravels it by night. Okay? So early on in the epic, we have one of the suitors saying, listen to what she did. She's playing us, right? She's teasing us. She's saying one thing, promising one thing, and doing something else. And that sounds like, from their perspective, a pretty legitimate thing to say. But then later, Penelope tells the same trick to Odysseus as the beggar and says, listen how clever I am to kind of preserve my husband's honor by delaying them with this trick. And so for her, it's a virtue, right? So who wins? Well, the winner. History is written by the winners, and the they hope that later. So she ends up alive and they're dead. So yes, it was a virtuous thing because she's reunited with her husband and she's able to preserve her marriage and things like that. Right? So the difference in perspectives is really interesting. There's also things like classicism, ageism, misogyny, consent, double standards, even animal cruelty. There's got a lot of big stuff in it. I sort of mentioned that last, not a lot of it, but there's a real famous scene that is the favorite of all my students, where Odysseus is in disguise and he walks up, and his dog Argus, who was a puppy when he left, has been waiting for him for 20 years, and he's on a pile of dung because no one's taking care of him. And he looks up and goes, and dies. And so it's a commentary on how they've neglected this beautiful animal, and it shows some of the problems in the house and things like that. And Odysseus, of course, wipes away quietly to not betray his disguise. It's also useful. Okay, so lately, in recent years, we've had a number of uses of this. Margaret Atwood, perhaps you're familiar with her from like The Handmaid's Tale, right? Wrote the Penelope, which is the story of the Odyssey from, similar story, but from Penelope's perspective as she's waiting. But it's effectively a feminist commentary that talks about the effects of perspective and storytelling, and also sexual and class-based double standards. So even though it's a novella, it's really interesting in terms of like issuing a feminist perspective. Bill Christensen has recently published something on looking at the Odyssey from a psychological perspective. And his argument is that it's a therapeutic model for coping with the exigencies of chance and fate. So it can be used to help people kind of process this. Then Norman Fisher has written on it from a kind of spiritual perspective, drawing on like Christianity, Judaism, and Buddhism, and looking at different spiritual uses. And he argues that it provides guidance for navigating life challenges and pitfalls. I read the jacket copy there. And finally, Jonathan Shea, which may be the most important so far, or influential, I might say. He wrote Odyssey in America, Combat Trauma, and the Trials of Homecoming as a follow-up to his somewhat earlier Achilles in Vietnam, which looked at Achilles' experiences in battle from the Iliad as a PTSD kind of episode. And he's been very influential. I don't know if y'all are aware that there are some movements now that use these myths, and in addition to some of the Greek dramas, to help veterans process combat trauma and the troubles with coming home. And then there's some broader uses with that as well. So I'm actually developing a course on that right now, which I'll be teaching in the fall and next winter as well. So useful, but that's not all. Influence, so much influence. So I found this quote from the Greek Reporter, which says, Homer's Odyssey has been voted, I'm not sure by who, but doesn't matter because it works for my argument, the most influential story to have shaped the entire world, according to a poll of more than 100 international authors, academics, journalists, and critics conducted by Britain's BBC. So, to be honest, I would say it's certainly up there. But I might think about like Ovid's Metamorphoses as a very influential work, which pervades almost everything everywhere. But actually, Ovid was also shaped by Homer as well, so perhaps Homer gets precedence there. But also, we might think about the Bible and some other things like that. But certainly, this belongs at or very near the top. So I'll give you some examples. Literary influence. So over here, thank you for pulling this. We've got some of these works. Virgil's Aeneid. There were also later Greek literary works that were influenced by him. But Virgil's Aeneid, Don Quixote, Ulysses, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, the Iliad, Percy Jackson series, and Madeline Miller's Circe. So this is my extra book. See? I did my homework. I did the assignment. So I don't know if you're familiar with Madeline Miller, but I think she's fantastic. And look at this cover. Is this not an awesome cover? Oh my gosh. So she wrote this from this perspective of Circe, who's the witch, whom Odysseus encounters. She turns his men into pigs. And he stays with her for an extended period of time. She ends up being a helper to him. But it's very well written, I think. It's lovely. It's very well researched. It talks about a lot of the mythological material that comes from the Odyssey and elsewhere that's very well known. But she also delves into some more obscure mythology, which is fantastic. And once in a while I'm looking that up and I'm like, is that right? Yes, it is. And she's got it. So it's definitely worth a read. But I'll also mention her, I got one on the slides. Her Song of, dang it. There we go. Song of Achilles, which she made as a companion to the Iliad, which tells the story of the Iliad from the perspective of Patroclus, who was Achilles' close companion, and some people think probably lover, although it's ambiguous in the Iliad. She makes it explicit, and it's very, very well done. Both have been, at some point, the rights have been bought for TV, but I think they lapsed for the Song of Achilles. And I don't know what's happening with this because it was supposed to come out as an HBO series in 2020, and I haven't heard any updates, and I haven't seen it. So hopefully it's still in the works because I think that'd be fantastic. And she also does some interesting things with kind of this myth-making stuff where she turns it around. So maybe you heard somebody saying this, but that's not how it was, right? They just like to put women down, stuff like that. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I'm probably going on too long. I could talk about this for a long, long, long time. Okay, so film, right? All kinds of films. Just a select few here. The Wizard of Oz, Sullivan's Travels, Red River, Ulysses, of course. That's with Kirk Douglas from 1954. The Searchers, Contempt, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, if you're an anime fan. Summersby, Angels and Insects, Yuli's Gold, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Full Mountain, so many. But I'm going to focus just real quickly here on The Searchers. Has anyone heard of The Searchers? A few, okay, maybe. For some of you, it's the most important and critically acclaimed movie that you've never heard of. And it's awesome. It's one of my favorites. And it itself has been enormously influential in movies, especially for one that's so not well known to the general public. But for instance, Taxi Driver, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Star Wars, Hardcore, Paris, Texas, Attack of the Clones, Breaking Bad, Age of Ultron, and more. Just have either homages or influence, or some of these are actually almost exact remakes in different contexts. So I just read that Attack of the Clones even has like a montage that's like a shot for shot kind of homage to the Searchers. So I have to go look at that again because I didn't notice it the first time. So Deer Hunter, Once Upon a Time in the West, so many. Also influence in art. In antiquity, of course, we have lots of artistic works that are drawing on the episodes from the Odyssey and Greek face painting and Roman wall painting, and also to a lesser extent, but somewhat in sculpture. But even into the modern period, we have things, artists that are drawing on these episodes as well. So we have Circe and the Cyclops and the Sirens, everywhere from the 17th century to the 20th and beyond. It's almost everything. So other influences, it pops up in music a lot. So you can kind of read some of these. Some of them are more obvious than others, but according to heavy metal classicists, 67 bands reference Odysseus or Ulysses in their lyrics, which is interesting, like that heavy metal and the Odyssey seem to have a real connection. That seems surprising to me. Poetry, there's lots of poetry that's influenced by the Odyssey and takes it a cue from that. So there's a few of them here. Come off these. Ithaca is one of my favorites, but also H.P., Margaret Atwood, Louis Gluck, A.T. Stallings, and there are many, many more. I have a list, but I can't find it right now. So, video games make a natural kind of pairing with the Odyssey because of all the adventures, right? These conflicts that Odysseus has in his narrative tale of how he got there, with the Lotus Eaters, the Sirens, the Cyclops, Circe, and others. So a lot of video games have drawn on it. And even though I'm not a big video game fan, here are just a few of them that have a clear and direct connection with the Odyssey. And what else? Entomb. Oh, I'm wrapping it up. So it's the best book ever because it has something for everyone. Because it is rich, layered, and complex. It is perhaps the most influential work in the Western world. It's got staying power. So right here, I want to give McDowell a little quote in the spirit of Roll Tweet. So he shared a quotation from James Joyce saying that the complexity of his Ulysses would keep professors busy for centuries arguing over what he meant. So, in Roll Tweet's spirit, to be provocative, I'll say, well, I got millennia, right? Not just centuries, I got millennia. So, yes, staying power. And it's both high art and it's also just a good, enjoyable story. So you can enjoy it either way. So just real quickly, some suggestions for further reading in addition to the Circe, which I absolutely recommend. I got 3 translations here that I kind of recommend if you're interested. So the Lattimore is one that is more like a literal translation. So it's being very faithful to the original in a lot of ways. And the Lombardo, as I've talked about, is less kind of literal. It's more in the spirit of it, but it's also more accessible. So that's a reason to go with Lombardo. Emily Wilson has a new translation, and it's been much lauded. It is. She's the first female translator of the Odyssey, and there's some important changes she makes. None of these is perfect, and any classicists will find a quibble with each of them, and I find some quibbles with her, but I like some of the stuff she does. For instance, she calls a slave a slave. Many translators kind of just skim over the fact that they call them handmaidens, things like that, as kind of disguising the fact that this was sort of a brutal society that had slavery as one of its primary institutions. So she's doing some interesting things like that, as well as some feminist stuff. So that's good too. So for viewing, like if you want to see the story of the Odyssey, well, Kimberly's Ulysses is not bad. And in a lot of ways, I like that one, and I used it in class. And I would say it's better than Konchalovsky's Odyssey miniseries. I still enjoy it in some ways, but I particularly dislike how it handles Penelope, which is very important to me as someone who looks at women. But my two favorites are the Coen Brothers' Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which is not obviously an exact replication, but it has a lot of the spirit of the original. And The Simpsons, in episode 14 from season 13, Tales of the Public Domain, it has like an 8-minute telling where Homer's telling the story of the Odyssey. Get it? And it's awesome. It's very condensed, of course, and it's not like exact or perfect, but it gets a lot of the themes in there a lot better than, for instance, Konchalovsky's miniseries, which takes a lot longer. So you might be able to YouTube that. I don't know. But I really like it. So if you're interested in its influence, since I do a lot of stuff on film, I've given you a couple of articles here that I liked fairly well. The first one in particular, just very good. But if you like Westerns, I looked at the searchers of the Western Odyssey. One on Penelope, because she's often, I think she really suffers often from her treatment in film. And I think she's a more powerful figure in many ways in the version from the 8th century BC than she is in the 20th century in America. Meredith Safran, you might not have seen Angels and Insects, but I thought this was an excellent paper, and it's worth seeing the movie so that you can read the paper and see the connections. So that's a really good one as well. And Dana Siegel has written on Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which is also fun if you like that movie. So. And I think that's it. That's it. So, best book ever.
Are you okay taking some questions?
Sure, sure.
I have one, but I want to hear yours first. While you're thinking of your question. So, we've recently seen in the last 20 years or so tellings of familiar tales from the underdog's point of view. Wicked, Maleficent. I don't know that you put Circe in that because you're already maybe, she's not like someone that you need to drum up a lot of sympathy for. But if there was something in the line of Wicked or Maleficent from this that you'd like to see, whose perspective would you like to see taken?
Well, probably Penelope's. And that has been done in the Delphiad, of course, but I've never seen that on film. And I think that there's a lot of room to do that and do it well. There also might be some space for doing it from the perspective of the maids in Odysseus' household, or even his swineherd. He allies himself with the swineherd Eumaeus. So it's interesting in terms of class. The Greeks were very classist, elitist. But this epic in particular, it's his swineherd and his cowherd who are the loyal servants that he confides in, even for his wife and things like that. So some of their perspective might be interesting too, I think. Anyone else?
Do they even teach this in high school anymore?
I think that they do. I've had students who've read it in high school and are like, oh, I'm going to read this again. And they're like, oh, there's so much more. I get kind of frustrated with students who say, oh, I've already read that. I'm like, so have I, like 5,000 times. And you can still get more out of it the more you read. So they'll teach it very differently in high school. I taught high school for 1 year and quickly got out. Because you can't delve quite as deep into some of the more troubling and problematic issues in high school. But I think it is still taught. More of my students have read that, certainly, than almost anything else from classical antiquity, except maybe Oedipus, Rex, Oedipus the King. Many of them will have read that as well. But nobody reads the Iliad or anything like that in high school anymore. So. Yes?
Well, again, while waiting for others, if you don't mind, let's talk a little bit about the Iliad. It seems that we're consuming more and more of the Odyssey without having read the Iliad. Is that a mistake?
Yes and no. Certainly, I think the Odyssey is a great entry into the classical world. I think in some ways the Iliad is harder to kind of appreciate on a casual read than the Odyssey, right? But it's certainly worth doing. And you asked me to do the best book ever, so I'm making an argument for the Odyssey, but I didn't say it was my favorite book ever. And personally, I like the Iliad better. But I think in order to make an argument for the masses, the Odyssey has more things that can be offered up to everyone. But I think studying the Iliad and then the Odyssey is absolutely worth it. And then, of course, we're going to send out shooters from there. Well, you also got to read this, and this. There's so much. And the more that you get into classical kind of literature and mythology, the more you learn to appreciate it because it's so interconnected and complex and so many different things. So, but the Odyssey is a good place to start because you can appreciate it without knowing much of that other stuff and because of its accessibility. But absolutely, once you've read that and decided that you love it, then we'll go on to the Iliad. So, anybody else? Did I convince you?
Not that it's my best book, but I'll look at it again.
All right. As long as I beat you down. I wish he was here because I was wanting to say that in front of him.
Well, that's some good news is that the case will be made via video. So tell your friends who weren't here. It takes my colleagues a couple of days, but they'll turn this into a video that's on the college's YouTube channel. And I think Amy, we send that link to her, and then she'll have the link for you as well. I hope that you're going to be able to join us next Tuesday. Brett Wiebel is going to be here, and he's going to talk about the work of Thomas Pynchon. I'm really looking forward to that because I have to confess, I don't really know much.
I don't either.
Yeah. But for now, we'd be remiss though if you, or at least I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to join me in expressing our appreciation to Dr. Kirsten Day for today's talk.
It's nice to be in person.
It is nice. Thank you.